Good evening and welcome back to the Four Lakes Church of Christ meeting together in Madison, Wisconsin. We're so glad to have you with us tonight for our Wednesday evening Bible study, and tonight we're returning to our series of lessons from Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And tonight we are continuing in particular with our study of the book of Deuteronomy. So we want to invite you to be finding a Bible and turning with us to Deuteronomy chapters 15 and 16. We'll be covering those two chapters tonight, Deuteronomy chapters 15 and 16. As always, if you have any questions, any comments about tonight's class, if you have something that we need to be praying about as a congregation, we want to invite you to get in touch. You can send me a message to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You could also call or send a text to 608-224-0274. We are very thankful to be back in Madison. I may give more of an update this coming Lord's Day, but I spent the first half of last week camping in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And then I came home and picked up my wife so that we could head up to Eau Claire and Marshfield together, where we did not go camping. But I do hope that all of you were able to catch Doug Burleson's lesson from the Psalms last Wednesday evening. Just a great example of expository preaching. A good, very timely lesson based on the Word of God. If you did not get that notification, let me know about that and I'd be happy to send it to you. But a very good lesson, I thought, from Brother Doug last Wednesday evening. But as I said, tonight we are back to our study of Deuteronomy. And just by way of review, since it's been a couple weeks up to this point, we've learned that Deuteronomy is basically a series of farewell addresses from Moses to the people, and the book is basically a repeating of the law of Moses as this new generation gets ready to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. So Moses is on his way out. Joshua is about to take over as the new leader. We know that an entire generation has died off in the wilderness due to their whining and complaining. And this new younger crowd, they need to hear God's law again. It had been a number of years since the law was first given, so they need a reminder before they cross over. And we've noted that Deuteronomy really emphasizes the love of God. It's not just this cold, hard recitation of a legal document as we might expect it to be. It's not that at all. But it's a book where Moses encourages the people by reminding them of God's love, and he's really imploring them to love God in return. So that's kind of what we're looking at in the book of Deuteronomy. And we also learned that Deuteronomy is quoted quite a few times in the New Testament, including by Jesus. He quotes this book 3 times when he's tempted by Satan after the fasting in the wilderness. Well, tonight we're going to continue with what is basically a review of certain aspects of the Law of Moses. So let's jump right into it tonight by looking at Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. The first paragraph here in Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 through 6. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all this commandment which I am commanding you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you, and you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow, and you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. So, by way of reviewing the law, Moses reminds the people that all debts were to be given every 7 years. And this seems to be God's way of protecting his people from this endless cycle of debt and poverty. And I know today it's possible to get in debt and to never get out. There's really no light at the end of the tunnel for some situations. And so, for example, we may borrow and borrow and borrow due to some maybe financial crisis, maybe overspending, just different reasons for doing that. But there's a point where the interest and the payments have a way of getting so out of control that we will literally never be able to get out of that. And we're just under this huge pile. And after a while, we may just barely be paying the interest on those loans and the credit cards and the bills that are coming from all different directions, and we lose hope. And certainly that's the way it could also be, I believe, in ancient Israel, just that concept But in ancient Israel, though, notice God structured their economy in a way that debt was never to be long term. In the seventh year, all debts were to be forgiven. And some have tied this perhaps to this idea that they were to let their land lie fallow. So they were not to plant or harvest in the seventh year. So maybe that was kind of a special challenge for them. So maybe that's tied to that. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But it's just interesting that this applies to their fellow Israelites, their neighbors, their brothers, and it does not apply to outsiders. But the forgiveness did not apply to those outside the nation. Well, in verse 4, part of the reason for this was so that there would not be any poor among them because the land was so productive. And we'll get to what appears to be a possible contradiction in the next paragraph where God addresses the poor. I think some other translations do a better job of the New American Standard on this, like so that you wouldn't have any poor. It's not guaranteeing there will never be any poor people, but that was God's plan that there would never be any poor people. So to me, it seems that the economy would be so robust that there really wouldn't be any poor by necessity. God would bless them, and everybody is invited to partake in those blessings. But the blessings, though, would be conditional. And so I guess we could say that if someone chooses to disobey, well, that person would in fact be excluded from those blessings and they would end up being poor. Not that sin is the reason for all poverty today on a personal level. Well, I know at the end we find that this applies to the nation as a whole, as not just individuals, so it applied to individuals primarily, but also as a nation. God says that they would be in a position where they would lend to other nations, but they themselves would never need to borrow from any other nation. Of course, assuming that they obeyed the Lord. If they would obey, this would be true, and this prosperity would enable them to rule over other nations. So just a reminder here, the borrower is slave to the lender. Remember, King Solomon says that. He'll point that out later in the book of Proverbs. The borrower is slave to the lender. So that's true in a personal level. It's also true, I believe, on a national level, and that's what God is getting at here. So God's people then, if they obeyed the Lord, they would be in a position of lending to other nations and thereby ruling over them instead of the other way around. And I know we're not under the law of Moses today. We kind of need to give that disclaimer almost every time we dig into this in terms of being under the same covenant that they were in back then. But how are we as a nation right now doing in terms of borrowing and lending? As a nation, are we lending to other nations or are we primarily borrowing from other nations? Well, we are in debt, aren't we? We are horrifically in debt as a nation. As a nation, it seems that we owe other nations more than we could ever possibly repay. And that right there is not a good position to be in. But in ancient Israel, though, if they obeyed God, God says that they would lend to other nations and they would never need to borrow themselves. So let's continue then with Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7 through 11, the next paragraph. Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need and whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him. Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. So notice, after just saying that there will be no poor among them, the law now gives some instructions concerning what to do if there is a poor man among you. Well, I think we need to recognize here that there are many reasons why someone may be poor. And some of those reasons, of course, may go back to the choices we make, and, other reasons also that may be completely beyond our control. Today, for example, I believe medical bills may still be one of the leading causes of bankruptcy. And I know many of us listening tonight are really only one or two paychecks away from financial ruin. So things are going along just fine. We suddenly get this terrifying diagnosis, and maybe in a week or so we can no longer work and the bills pile up and we are in some serious financial trouble within just a few days. And that may be due to no fault of our own. I think we understand that. Other times, though, we may make some choices that lead to poverty. And we discussed this in our sermon series through Proverbs about a year ago. I may do something that lands me in jail, for example, that's devastating financially to me and my family. I may get caught up in gambling or some drug addiction or some other addictive behavior, for example. And those choices may also lead to poverty, even though God would prefer me not being in that situation. Well, we don't have the details here in Deuteronomy 15. All we know is that somebody's poor. And God's instruction to the others is, do not harden your heart or close your hand to such people, but instead be generous and provide for that person's needs. And let's note here, we're talking about needs, not wants. There is a distinction, I believe, to be made there. Now, I want us to think back to the previous paragraph where we learned that the law said that all debts were to be forgiven every 7 years. And I will admit, when I first read through that, I thought to myself, well, if I'm in year number 6, I'm probably not going to be loaning any money to my deadbeat neighbor who's not going to be paying me back. That thought crossed my mind. I don't know if it crossed your mind or not. Maybe that's just me. However, we find here in this paragraph, God anticipates that way of thinking, doesn't he? God knows how we think. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And so he gives the reminder, if I can afford to loan to a poor person, I am not to take into account that whole 7-year cycle of debt forgiveness. And I know that may not seem like a very good financial decision on my part, but God emphasizes here that God is blessing his people tremendously. So in context, they're moving into this brand new land flowing with milk and honey. And so I think in a sense then, I'm not really loaning my money to my neighbor in Israel, but I'm really giving them God's money. At least that's the way I would take this. And if this allows the poor to get back on their feet financially, I think this helps explain why there would be no poor in the land. You know, they may be poor for a short time due to some unforeseen circumstance, but I think Moses is saying that God will take care of this over the long run. Our job is to take care of each other, of course, if we were living back in those times. And again, this is under the law of Moses. But I do think we have similar principles under the new law where we're told to take care of those in need, especially those in the household of the faith. There in the last chapter of the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 6, there are priorities for the help that we give to others. Well, let's continue with Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 through 18. Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 through 18. If your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years. But in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. It shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you, then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also you shall do likewise to your maidservant. It shall not seem hard to you when you set him free, for he has given you 6 years with double the service of a hired man. So the Lord your God will bless you in whatever you do. Well, in the context of dealing with poverty, we now get back to a part of the law dealing with slavery. And this is a repeat for us from the book of Exodus. But if it gets so bad that someone has to sell themselves into slavery, indentured servitude, I think we would refer to this from the early days of our country coming over from Great Britain. God allows that kind of slavery, but there is to be a light at the end of the tunnel. So in the 7th year, the slave has the ability to choose. He can leave, Or, on the other hand, he can choose to stay willingly. And it's almost, I would say, more of an employee at this point. Notice the terminology, at least in the New American Standard, switches from slave to servant. And I didn't look that up. I don't know if there's a difference in the Hebrew word. Now I'm curious about that or feel like I really need to look it up. But it seems like a shift. On one hand, there is slavery, but if he chooses to stay, he's more of a servant. Again, almost more like an employee at this point. And it seems that this would encourage masters to treat their people well. In other words, if a master is abusive, well, that person's never going to choose to stay. On the other hand, if the master treats this person well, there's more of a chance that he or she may want to stick around beyond that 7-year period. If the slave chooses to leave, the master is to send them off with a huge pile of blessings. I think that's the way I would summarize that. After all, the slave has provided double the service of a hired hand. So it's not just an employee that has been serving them for the past 6 or 7 years, but this person has actually lived in their household and has served them much more than even an employee would have served. On the other hand, if the slave chooses to stay, the sign of this was for the slave to have his ear pierced with an awl, AWL, as a sign of that permanent servitude. So the piercing of the ear. And of course, this is the basis of the song we sometimes sing to God, "Pierce my ear, O Lord, I pray, take me to your door this day. I will serve no other gods, Lord, I'm here to stay," and so on. So God, therefore, gives the people a choice. Slavery was not ideal. It's not the way God originally designed the human relationships to be, but it was regulated for the good of all involved, for the owner and also for the person who has perhaps sold themselves into this situation. Well, let's continue tonight by looking at Deuteronomy 15:19 through 23. Deuteronomy 15:19 through 23. You shall consecrate to the Lord your God all the firstborn males that are born of your herd and of your flock. You shall not work with the firstborn of your herd, nor shear the firstborn of your flock. You and your household shall eat it every year before the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses. But if it has any defect, such as lameness or blindness or any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. You shall eat it within your gates. The unclean and the clean alike may eat it, as a gazelle or a deer. Only you shall not eat its blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. Here we just have a brief reminder that they were to dedicate the firstborn of their herds and their flocks to the Lord. And I don't know if we're specifically told this. It seems to be related to the firstborn being saved from the angel of the Lord passing over the people. Remember, that deal was they had to paint the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of their home. And if they did not, the firstborn would die. And of course, the Israelites did. Their firstborn did not die. Therefore, from that moment on, all of the firstborn were, in a sense, dedicated or set aside to the Lord. And so the animal here was to be perfect physically. It was to be sacrificed. It was then to be shared with others as an act of worship, almost like a big fellowship dinner, as we might explain it today. But they were not to eat any of its blood. And of course, that goes back to a number of other passages. Well, let's continue into the next chapter with an overview of the 3 major feasts where the men had to come together to celebrate. And this is a review for us, but let's look at the first one, the Passover, Deuteronomy 16, verses 1 through 8. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Observe the month of Abib, and celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd, in the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat with it unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, so that you may remember all the days of your life, the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall remain overnight until morning. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name, you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at the sunset, at the time you came out of Egypt. You shall cook and eat it in the place which the Lord your God chooses. In the morning you are to return to your tents. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a solemn assembly to the Lord your God. you shall do no work on it. The Passover was celebrated to remember the exodus from Egypt. Notice they had to come together to celebrate this as a group. Eventually, they would do this in Jerusalem. They don't know that yet, but in the place that God tells you, so he's going to tell them in the future. And part of that Passover was that they were not to eat any leaven, but the leaven or the yeast was to be completely purged from their homes. And this was to be done to remember how they ate unleavened bread on their way out of Egypt. They didn't even have time to let the bread rise. And that's how quickly they left the land of Egypt. And so I think he describes this as the bread of affliction. And so, not that it was painful to eat, but it was a reminder of that difficult circumstance. In my life today, as I was just reading this again and going through this for the class tonight, I'm thinking of the fry bread that you'll find among some of the Native American tribes out in the Southwest and the Pacific Northwest. Whenever I travel in those areas, it's a highlight for me to find fry bread, and you see it among the Native American tribes. You see it here in Madison. They now offer fry bread tacos at the Ho-Chunk headquarters, kind of on the southeast side of Madison, not at the casino. On the Madison side of the interstate, just south of the Beltline, they have the Ho-Chunk headquarters there. But as I understand it, fry bread went back to those times when the Native Americans were kept apart in reservations, and the government would give them huge quantities of flour and lard. And so the fry bread was not a Native American dish traditionally, but it became that way because of the limited supplies that they were given by the U.S. government way back in those early days. And so it was kind of a form of persecution. And they got this, and so now they have tons and tons of flour and lard. What do we do with that? And they made fry bread, and now they're kind of known for that. And it's a wonderful thing. They've honed the recipe through the years, and I love sharing with them like that. But I was just thinking the parallel to unleavened bread. Not that it was a terrible thing to eat, but it was associated in their minds with the exodus from Egypt. And so they were to eat this as a memorial from that day going forward. And notice Moses emphasizes here this is not some kind of do-it-yourself type worship that you can do on your own at home, but they were to come together for this. This was a group memorial. This is something they did together as a congregation. And so in that sense, certainly there are some parallels between the Passover and the Lord's Supper, the way that we celebrate it today as a group. It is described in Corinthians, I believe, as a sharing, as a communion. All right, let's continue with the Feast of Weeks. So this is the second big celebration where everybody had to come together, or Pentecost, I think, as we would know this today, although it's not described that way in this passage. But this is Deuteronomy 16, verses 9 through 12. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. You shall begin to count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. Then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give just as the Lord your God blesses you. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite who is in your town, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your midst, in the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. So, 7 weeks after the Passover, if I've understood this correctly, they were to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, as it was known. And I think this was pretty much kind of heading toward a harvest celebration. But once again, they were to come together for worship. This is something that they were not really doing on their own. This was something they did together as a group. And let's continue tonight with the third of these. This is the Feast of Booths, or tents, or tabernacles. This is Deuteronomy 16, verses 13 through 17. Deuteronomy 16, 13 through 17. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. 3 times in a year your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, and at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. Well, the Feast of Booths here, number 3, was to last a week. Notice it was intended for everybody, even the outsiders. Huge party. This one was to be a time of great rejoicing. And so, in summary, in that last little paragraph here, notice there were 3 main celebrations where the people were to come together in one place. And at the end here, one thing I appreciate is that the people were not to appear before the Lord empty-handed. In other words, they came together for worship. And as they came together, they were to come with an offering. They were to come with something in their hands to offer to the Lord. And you know, also, when we worship, we bring something to God, don't we? Back then, they were to give as they were able. This was not a tax. This was something that they brought joyfully. And I believe that that applies to us today as well. Worship is our way of thanking God for what he's done for us. So we are not to appear before the Lord empty-handed, either in Deuteronomy, and I believe it would apply also to our worship today in some sense. Well, let's conclude tonight with the last paragraph here. Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 22. Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 22. You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eye of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah, or any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make for yourself. You shall not set up for yourself a sacred pillar, which the Lord your God hates. By way of summary, they were to appoint impartial judges once they moved into the land. They were forbidden from setting up any Asherah, that is, idols of the local female deity, kind of Mrs. Baal in my mind. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but kind of the female counterpart to Baal. Don't honor that in any way. And just one brief note here, this wasn't just about substituting the Asherah for God, but God prohibits them from worshiping both. So God doesn't just want their worship, but he wants their worship exclusively. And God is very clear about this in this chapter. Well, this brings us to a place where we can pause for a week. Next week, we want to continue with chapters 17 and 18, if the Lord wills. So far, we've been able to move rather quickly. We're covering about 2 chapters a week. Deuteronomy is an important book. I don't want us, though, to be kind of bogged down in this book for a year, so we're moving through it rather quickly. As always, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know there's many other things we could be doing on a Wednesday night, but if there's something that we need to be praying about, if there's some way we can serve you as a congregation, if you have some question we can answer, if there's some way we can encourage you, we want to invite you to reach out by sending an email to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You could also call or send a text to me, 608-224-0274. As we close tonight, let's all go to God in prayer together. Our Father in heaven, we praise you tonight for being the God of Moses and the Israelites. We understand from your word that you brought your people out of slavery in Egypt. You brought them safely through the wilderness. And as we studied tonight, you brought them to a land flowing with milk and honey. You blessed them with some amazing financial resources. And you gave them the ability to take care of each other. We know that you have given us this ability today as well as your people, and so we ask for your help in opening our hearts to those around us who need the help that we can provide. Help us to remember that you have blessed us so that we can bless others. Our Father, tonight we ask for your blessing on the new president, that you would surround him with wise counsel, and that you would give him the wisdom to follow those words of good advice that he may hear. Father, bless us tonight. Be with us as your people, that we can shine as lights in this world. In Jesus we pray. Amen.